Alright, say what you will about James O'Keefe, one thing is clear.
Dude knows how to litigate.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is Winnie the Westie getting ready for his early afternoon nap. You're gonna sleep? You're gonna sleep. Alright, and you might hear some noise behind me. Someone is getting their car towed. These are the risks and perils when your office is your car. So the big news of the day is James O'Keefe is suing Twitter for defamation as a result of their permanent suspension. Yes, I can't believe I'm actually unironically using such Orwellian terms. Twitter refers to a ban as a permanent suspension. Twitter originally permanently suspended the official Project Veritas account, then they permanently suspended the Project Veritas Action account, and a couple of months later they banned
permanently suspended
James O'Keefe, and why? The reason is what led to this action and defamation. Supreme Court of the State of New York, County of Westchester, James O'Keefe III, plaintiff versus Twitter Inc. defendant complaint. Now, if the district of this court rings a bell, the County of Westchester, it should, because that is where Project Veritas filed their defamation lawsuit against the New York Times, and they just got a relatively rather favorable judgment out of that court. So it would seem that James O'Keefe III likes this jurisdiction. He has gotten a favorable judgment out of this jurisdiction relatively recently, so he has decided to file in this jurisdiction yet again. Summary of the action. This defamation action arises from Twitter's false and defamatory April 15, 2021 statement concerning Twitter's decision to ban plaintiff James O'Keefe, an investigative journalist followed by over 926,000 Twitter users as of the time he was banned. Twitter's false and defamatory claim was that it removed Mr. O'Keefe because he, quote, operated fake accounts, end quote, as reported by journalists exemplified in figure 1 below. At James Baragona, confirming James O'Keefe's account has been, quote, permanently suspended, end quote. A Twitter spokes tells me, per their policy, quote, you can't mislead others on Twitter by operating fake accounts, and you can't artificially amplify or disrupt conversations through the use of multiple accounts, end quote. Now, I don't want to play devil's advocate, although I think that in defending Twitter in any way, I am quite literally playing devil's advocate. I see how Twitter is going to have some wiggle room here as to the double-faceted nature of the justification they gave for the ban, the permanent suspension. And another thing, before I move on, I think any journalist, anybody who qualifies themselves as a journalist, should have their journalist card revoked for referring to anything as a permanent suspension. Use language properly. It is a ban. No Orwellian euphemisms. Call it what it is, but I digress. Moving on. Mr. O'Keefe is a journalist whose reputation depends on his ethical and transparent conduct and his production of reliable and accurate news reporting. Twitter's published claim that Mr. O'Keefe, quote, operated fake accounts, end quote, is patently and demonstrably false. Perhaps, but what of the second facet of their claim that you cannot amplify or disrupt conversations using multiple accounts? I have no doubt that that is what Twitter is going to hang their hat on. Alright, but that is enough playing devil's advocate. Now, what I like about the introductory paragraphs is that James O'Keefe is not laying it too thick with the sympathy, with the empathy, with the drama. He is quite matter-of-factly saying that he is an independent journalist, and if journalists have one thing that is important to them, it is their integrity and honesty. So when you have Twitter, one of the biggest tech giants on earth, labeling James O'Keefe basically a fraud by saying that he operates fake accounts, that does damage to the reputation of a journalist. Now, some of you out there might disagree that James O'Keefe is a journalist. You might think what you want of James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. It doesn't matter. We can all agree that when it comes to a journalist, nothing is more important than their reputation. Moreover, as detailed below, as the owner and operator of its own platform, Twitter was in a unique position to know that this claim was false. Alternatively, given the extent of its knowledge and information, Twitter acted with reckless disregard for the falsity of this claim when it published it. Twitter's false claim that Mr. O'Keefe used, quote, fake accounts, end quote, on Twitter has caused Mr. O'Keefe damage, and unless retracted, will continue to cause him damage, as set forth in detail below. The lawsuit then goes on to describe jurisdiction and venue. We don't need to get into that. It goes on to describe the parties. We don't need to go over that, except to say something that I didn't actually know before reading this lawsuit. Project Veritas and Project Veritas Actions are not-for-profit organizations filed under the 501c3 and 501c4 provisions of law, respectively. The lawsuit goes on to explain that Project Veritas and Project Veritas Action were created for the purposes of being investigative journalists, exposing media bias, etc., etc., and then we get into the bans on Project Veritas and Project Veritas Action. Twitter, quote, actions, end quote, against Project Veritas and plaintiffs' accounts. Project Veritas and Project Veritas Action operated corporate Twitter accounts until February 2021. These were the official accounts of Project Veritas and Project Veritas Action by which their respective official communications would be published on Twitter. On February 11, 2021, Project Veritas published a video showing Project Veritas reporters seeking to interview Facebook Vice President Guy Rosen outside a residence. This video was then published on Project Veritas' Twitter account. According to the lawsuit, Twitter then went on to suspend Project Veritas's account on the basis that it violated the provisions on privacy by showing Guy Rosen's home with the address in it. Project Veritas's argument or rebuttal is that they didn't show the street, they didn't show the city, they didn't even mention the state, and all that they had was the facade of the home with the address, and in any case, CNN and others had done the exact same thing, if not worse. Indeed, CNN had done the same thing on a video tweet with over 2.2 million views in which CNN reporter Drew Griffin confronted a private individual, accused her of spreading Russian disinformation, and exposed her private residential address for the world to see, as shown on figure 2, right. A figure that I am not going to show because I do not want to be accused of amplifying or contributing to that problem myself. The lawsuit then goes on to allege that this allegedly violating tweet by CNN is still publicly viewable on Twitter. The lawsuit then goes on to allege that Project Veritas Action account was permanently suspended by Twitter because it apparently tried to bypass the ban on Project Veritas's account. Only days later, Twitter then permanently suspended Project Veritas Action's Twitter account without warning, claiming the account was created to improperly attempt to get around the Project Veritas permanent suspension. Project Veritas Action is a separate legal entity from Project Veritas and maintained a separate Twitter account for years to publish its own content. Once again, Twitter refused to speak to Project Veritas about the suspension or the reason or it. Typo. Now, although Twitter initially suspended Project Veritas's account and subsequently turned that suspension into a permanent suspension and issued a permanent suspension against Project Veritas Action's account, they did not permanently suspend or ban James O'Keefe himself.
Until something happened.
Mr. O'Keefe exposes CNN. At no time prior to Mr. O'Keefe's permanent Twitter suspension on April 15, 2021, was he warned, advised, or otherwise given reason to know that Twitter believed he was using fake accounts. Beginning on April 13, 2021, Project Veritas published on its own website, as well as all major social media sites, a series of undercover reporting videos and reports concerning the political reporting of CNN. If you haven't already seen that expose, I recommend going to watch it wherever you can, although it won't come as anything of a surprise to anyone who has had their eyes remotely half open for the last year or two. It's basically a video of somebody at CNN, I think he's a tech guy, who thinks he's on a date that he picked up on Tinder apparently, admitting that CNN is basically in the business of promoting propaganda that they internally wished the numbers for the pandemic were worse so that they could be exploited for political purposes and clickbait purposes. Nothing new for anyone who has had their eyes half open. But what happens after James O'Keefe tweets a link to that video on his own personal Twitter account? That too will not come as a surprise to anybody who has had their eyes half open. On April 15, 2021, Mr. O'Keefe tweeted out the third of Project Veritas's video releases about CNN on his personal Twitter account, as well as on all major social media sites. The very same day, Mr. O'Keefe's personal Twitter account was abruptly and permanently suspended without providing Mr. O'Keefe warning or any prior notice. We then get into Twitter's allegedly defamatory statements. After suspending Mr. O'Keefe's personal Twitter account on April 15, Twitter, through an unnamed spokesperson, disseminated to media outlets the provably false statement that Mr. O'Keefe was, quote, operating fake Twitter accounts, end quote. Notably, Twitter made these public statements to third parties more than half an hour before communicating this information to Mr. O'Keefe. Other journalists republished Twitter's false statements, for example, as shown on figure 1 above, referring to a, quote, Twitter Spox, end quote, meaning, quote, spokesman, end quote. The reason Twitter never warned Mr. O'Keefe or otherwise took action relating to his supposed operation of, quote, fake accounts, end quote, as alleged above, prior to his permanent suspension, is that Mr. O'Keefe does not own, control, use, or operate fake Twitter accounts. Twitter's claim that Mr. O'Keefe, quote, misled others on Twitter by operating fake accounts, end quote, is false and defamatory. Now, we don't need to go over it in any great detail, but the lawsuit does go into some detail as to why this fake account policy was enacted by Twitter in the first place, and it goes back to the alleged Russian disinformation campaign that was waged on social media. Indeed, Twitter's entire, quote, fake accounts, end quote, policy, which it accused Mr. O'Keefe of violating by stating that he, quote, operated fake accounts, end quote, stems from the Russian disinformation campaign. Thus, by claiming Mr. O'Keefe operated, quote, fake accounts, end quote, Twitter was saying Mr. O'Keefe could not be trusted as a journalist because he was, quote, misleading others, end quote, via disinformation in the manner the Russian government is widely accused of doing to interfere in the US political process. Indeed, in response to allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 elections, Twitter announced January 29, 2018 that it was taking a number of active steps to, quote, make progress against potential manipulation of Twitter's platform, end quote, as part of its commitment, quote, to providing a platform that fosters healthy civic discourse and democratic debate, end quote. Remind me to insert here the bullcrap meme from Top Gun. Bullshit. The lawsuit then goes on to describe Twitter's internal policy procedure to verify suspicious accounts by, for example, asking for an email address for verification or cell number for verification. Bottom line, James O'Keefe comes to the conclusion that given Twitter's internal procedure to verify suspicious accounts, there is no way they could have not known that his account wasn't fake. I don't know if I said that right. You know what I mean. There is no way that Twitter could have thought James O'Keefe was operating a fake account. Given the extent of such monitoring and the prominence of Mr. O'Keefe's account, the odds would appear infinitesimal that Twitter could have concluded, albeit erroneously and negligently, that Mr. O'Keefe was operating fake accounts and formulated and disseminated a statement explaining its supposed reason for banning Mr. O'Keefe on the very same day and within hours of his use of that account to publicize embarrassing disclosures concerning CNN. In fact, Twitter necessarily knew that its claim that Mr. O'Keefe operated fake accounts was false or had information before it which would cause a reasonable person to harbor doubts as to truthfulness of the allegation that Mr. O'Keefe maintained fake accounts when it made these claims on April 15, 2021. On information and belief, Twitter made such claims with knowledge of their falsity in order to distract and detract from Project Veritas' CNN release of the same day. Twitter made this clear by its actions after it suspended Mr. O'Keefe. And then the lawsuit ends with the claim for defamation and the standard allegations you need in order to prove defamation, that the statements were false. In James O'Keefe's case, because he is a public figure, that they were made with actual malice or willful recklessness, that the false statements have damaged James O'Keefe's reputation or will subject him to scorn or ridicule. And as we have seen in the judgment from the Project Veritas versus the New York Times lawsuit, I don't think James O'Keefe is going to be libel-proof. Accusing Mr. O'Keefe of misleading his readership by using fake or fraudulent Twitter accounts is extremely damaging to his reputation and imputes general disqualification to do his job as an investigative journalist by lowering the credibility of his reporting and general reputation for veracity. Prayer for relief, wherefore Mr. O'Keefe respectfully prays for judgment as follows. A. For judgment in favor of plaintiff against defendant. B. For general, special, and compensatory damages and according to proof. C. For punitive and exemplary damages according to proof. D. For a permanent injunction enjoining Twitter, its officers, agents, servants, employees, and all other persons acting in concert or participation with Twitter from further disseminating the false, misleading, and defamatory representations of fact concerning Mr. O'Keefe discussed above, and requiring Twitter to remove such statements in all forms in which they are posted. E. That this court award Mr. O'Keefe all reasonable costs, and F. That this court grants such other and further relief as this court deems equitable and just under the circumstances. So that is the lawsuit, and in my humble opinion, it is a well-drafted lawsuit, well-reasoned, succinctly put, and only alleges that which needs to be alleged. Now, the obvious argument that Twitter is going to raise is Section 230 immunity. Twitter is undoubtedly going to file a motion to dismiss on the basis of Section 230 Communications Decency Act immunity. They are just a platform. They are just enacting their policies to remove content from their platform, therefore they have immunity and cannot be sued for those actions. They are undoubtedly going to raise that argument, and James O'Keefe is obviously going to raise the retort that enacting policies to remove objectionable content is one thing, calling someone the owner of fake accounts when they are a journalist is another, and Section 230 does not protect you from defamation. On the substance of the lawsuit, I have no doubt Twitter is going to try to weasel out of their statement by saying, yes, we were talking about fake accounts and using multiple accounts to amplify or interfere with discussion, whatever that means. They're going to argue that they had a two-faceted statement, that fake accounts was one part of that, and using multiple accounts, which James apparently did, to amplify or interfere with discourse is itself against the policy. That being said, from the statement from the Spox or spokesperson, it certainly does seem that they accused James O'Keefe of operating fake Twitter accounts. To be continued. Obviously, there will be updates as soon as there are any, and I can shoot the video, edit the video, and publish the video. And with that said, if you like my videos, you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm.
60% of the time, it works every time.
If you want to support the channel, all of the support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube membership. We've got merch, Anti-Media. Robert Barnes and I do weekly live streams every Sunday. We do sidebars every Wednesday with a guest. We are also on Rumble and have a page on Locals.
Viva FarnsLaw.locals.com.
With that said, more important than anything, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!